Hello and welcome to Tales of Shadow. Do you know how dark and sinister the classic Brothers Grimm story Hansel and Gretel actually is? Before we begin, I must give a bit of a disclaimer. This telling of Hansel and Gretel is not for children, at least not unaccompanied children. It will contain adult language and adult content. Now don't misunderstand me. I won't be using vulgar language or crass words, but we will be discussing some serious topics. Unvarnished straight talk, because, well, that's what I do. So you can have your kids in the room, but you may have to explain some things along the way. Comprende? Okay, let's begin. Once upon a time, near a large forest, there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and his 2 children. The boy was named Hansel and the girl Gretel. They were poor and had very little to eat. And it wasn't long until a great famine came upon the land, and the father could no longer provide their daily bread. As he lay in bed one evening, tossing and turning, overcome with his thoughts and worry, he sighed and said to his wife, "What will become of us? How can we feed our poor children when we no longer have anything for ourselves?" "You know what, man?" the woman replied. "Tomorrow, early in the morning, we'll take the children out into the forest where it's thickest. There we'll light a fire for them, give them each a small piece of bread, and then we'll go to our work and leave them alone. They won't find their way back home, and we'll be rid of them." Okay, so right out of the gate, this woman, and to clarify, this is the stepmother, hatches the most sinister of plans. She doesn't offer to get a job or find some way to make ends meet. No, but instead reveals herself as the selfish psychopath that she is. Let's continue. "No, wife," said the man, "I won't do it. How could I bear it, leaving my children alone in the forest? The animals would soon come and tear them apart." "Oh, you fool," she said. "Then we'll all die of hunger, and you may as well get our coffins made now." And she gave him no peace until he agreed. "But I do pity the poor children," said the man. Okay, so we've addressed a little bit about the evil stepmother and now the father, who unfortunately is a weak man, and he demonstrates a classic example of moral cowardice. While he is heartbroken with the idea, he allowed himself to be coerced and manipulated into doing something he knows is wrong. He really needs to grow up and take charge, but don't hold your breath. The 2 children had also been unable to sleep because of hunger, and had heard what the stepmother had said to the father. Gretel wept bitter tears and said to Hansel, "Now it's all over for us." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Don't worry, I'll help us." And when the old grown-ups had fallen asleep, Hansel got up, put on his little coat, opened the lower door, and slipped outside. The moon was shining brightly, and the white pebbles that lay in front of the house glittered like shiny new coins. Hansel bent down and filled his little coat pocket with as many as he could fit. Then he went back, said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear little sister, and sleep peacefully. God will not abandon us," and lay down his head and went to bed. So, score points for Hansel. As they say, God helps those who help themselves. And just to make it clear, in many of these fairy tales, it is often that an appeal to God, or by living by some specific virtuous principles, there is a means to escape, defeat the antagonist, or find a happily ever after. So here we learn that Hansel isn't blindly optimistic, but he's portrayed as a character of faith, hope, and action. He is already strategizing for survival in the face of adversity. Now back to the story. As the day broke before the sun had even risen, the stepmother came and woke up the 2 children. "Get up, you lazy bones, we're going to the forest to gather wood." Then she gave each of them a small piece of bread and said, "Here's something for midday, but don't eat it beforehand. You won't get anything else." Gretel put the bread under her apron because Hansel had the stones in his pocket. Then they all set off together for the forest. After they had walked for a little while, Hansel stood still and looked back at the house. Then he did this again and again. The father said, "Hansel, what are you looking at, and why are you staying behind? Pay attention and don't forget your legs." "Oh, father," said Hansel, "I'm looking at my little white kitten, which is sitting on the roof and wants to say goodbye to me." The woman said, "Fool, that's not your kitten. That's the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel had not been looking at the kitten. He had been dropping one of the shiny pebbles from his pocket onto the path each time. So here we have Hansel mastering the art of misdirection. It's quite impressive. But sadly, he has to do this to his own weak father, who is too afraid to act against the evil stepmother. The father, despite his initial protests, perhaps convinced himself that he's being something of a peacemaker by going along to get along. In making a deal with this witch of a wife, he is sacrificing his children for a little peace. He deserves neither and will lose both. Now, where were we? When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now gather some wood, children. I'll make a fire so you don't freeze." Hansel and Gretel gathered brushwood, piling it into a small heap. The brushwood was set on fire, and as the flames burned high, the woman said, "Now lie down by the fire, children, and rest. We are going into the forest to chop wood. When we're done, we'll come back and fetch you." Hansel and Gretel sat around the fire, and when midday came, each ate their small piece of bread. And because they heard the sound of an axe chopping wood, they believed their father was nearby. But it wasn't the axe, it was a branch he had tied to a dead tree, and the wind was swinging it back and forth. And after they had sat there for a long time, their eyes grew heavy with tiredness, and they fell fast asleep. Utter wickedness. Now this is a truly sickening scene. This is where the father becomes fully complicit when he ties the rope to a broken branch. Think about the deception, providing a false sense of security to his children. Maybe you didn't know this, or you've forgotten. The world certainly has. In a family, the father has a responsibility to provide for and protect his family. The father has violated his conscience, abandoned his children, and forsook the sacred role of fatherhood. And poor Hansel and Gretel will pay for it. And yet the story grows darker still. When they finally woke up, it was already very dark. Gretel began to cry and said, "How will we ever get out of the forest now?" But Hansel comforted her. "Just wait a little while until the moon has risen. Then we'll find the way." And when the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and followed the pebbles which shimmered like freshly minted coins and showed them the way. Now this is interesting. In many cultures and languages there is a gender assigned to words, masculine or feminine. Not in the English language, but in the Romantic and Germanic languages, among others. In the French language and culture, for example, the moon, la lune, is feminine and is symbolically viewed as a woman. Its light is delicate, gentle, and it changes its disposition frequently. In German, however, der Mond, the moon is masculine and has a symbolic manly nature, and is viewed as dark, mysterious, brooding, and pensive. Remember, this is a German story, and as Hansel told Gretel, God will not abandon us. The moon symbolically plays the father figure, watching over them, guiding them with enough light to navigate home, protecting them as it were, but not overprotecting. As we continue in the story, we'll continue to see subtle symbols of divine intervention. But now let's continue on with the story. They walked through the entire night, and as day broke, arrived once again at their father's house. They knocked on the door, and when the stepmother opened it and saw that it was Hansel and Gretel, she said, "You naughty children, why did you sleep so long in the forest? We thought you didn't want to come back at all." But the father was glad, for it had weighed heavily on his heart that he had left them alone like that. Gaslighting, a word that is becoming quite popular as of late, thrown in conversations, albeit often very inaccurately. But what the mother did right here is a textbook example of gaslighting and blame shifting. She is trying to change the reality of what happened by calling the children naughty. She positions herself as a caring mother, then attempts to make them question their own memory of events, and then blames Hansel and Gretel as if the entire ordeal was their fault. Pure emotional abuse. Now back to the story that unfortunately gets even darker still. The children overheard the mother speaking to the father at night in bed. "Everything is eaten up again. We have only half a loaf of bread left, and after that the song is over. The children must go. We will take them deeper into the forest, so they can't find their way out again. There is no other salvation for us." It weighed heavily on the man's heart, and he thought it would be better if you shared your last bite with your children. But the woman would not listen to anything he said. She scolded him and reproached him. Who says A must also say B. And since he had given in the first time, he had to do so again. Wer es sagt, muss auch besagen. This is a German proverb. Who says A must also say B. You've committed and now you must follow through. A point of no return, if you will. Of course, this is not true at all, but we're dealing with a master manipulator and a capitulating weak man. She uses this proverb to leverage the fact that he's already done it once, and so he must do it again. Now, could you imagine being married to such an awful person? Or worse, being that type of person? Let's now rejoin our brave little friends, who have already been betrayed once, and yet a deeper betrayal awaits. The children had still been awake and had overheard the conversation. When the old ones were asleep, Hansel got up again, wanting to go outside and collect the pebbles as he had done the last time. But the woman had locked the door, and Hansel couldn't get out. However, he comforted his little sister. Don't cry, Gretel, just sleep peacefully. The dear God will help us. So here we have again another appeal to God. Early in the morning, the woman came and got the children out of bed. They each received their small piece of bread, but it was even smaller than the last time. On the way to the forest, Hansel crumbled his bread in his pocket, often stopping and dropping a crumb onto the ground. Hansel, why are you standing and looking around? Said the father. Keep walking. I'm looking at my little dove, which is sitting on the roof and wants to say goodbye to me. Hansel replied. Fool, said the woman. That's not your little dove, that's the morning sun shining on the chimney. But Hansel continued to drop crumbs one by one along the way. Hansel is distracting not only his parents from his plan of leaving breadcrumbs, but is also distracting Gretel with kind-hearted imagery, providing some cheer and optimism to his scared little sister. First the white cat, saying goodbye, and this time a dove. Both of these creatures have strong symbolism of spiritual and sacred meaning of protection, peace, and divinity. Now, is Hansel seeing these creatures, or is he just comforting his sister? The woman led the children even deeper into the forest, where they had never been in their entire lives. A large fire was made again, and the mother said, Just sit here, children, and if you get tired, you can sleep a little. We're going into the forest to chop wood, and in the evening, when we're done, we'll come and fetch you. When it was midday, Gretel had shared her bread with Hansel, who had scattered his piece along the way. Then they fell asleep, and the evening passed, but no one came for the poor children. They only awoke in the dark night, and Hansel comforted his little sister and said, Just wait, Gretel, until the moon rises. Then we will see the breadcrumbs I scattered, and they will show us the way home. When the moon rose, they set off, but they found no crumbs, for the thousands of birds that fly through the woods and fields have pecked them all up. Hansel said to Gretel, We will find the way, but they did not. They walked all night and another day, from the morning until evening, but they could not find their way out of the forest, and were so hungry, for they had nothing to eat but a few berries that grew on the ground. And because they were so tired their legs could no longer carry them, they lay down under a tree and fell asleep. This time the god of nature revealed through the moonlight that Hansel and Gretel were not going home. Was this a cruel joke? Or is there a better future ahead if they continue deeper into the darkness of the forest? While things are not looking good for poor Hansel and Gretel, on the bright side, they don't have to deal with their awful stepmother. Twice abandoned, betrayed, lost, cold, scared, and hungry. Like Job of the Old Testament, despite their suffering and trials, they didn't curse God and die, as Job's wife advised. Not Job, and not Hansel and Gretel. They still have hope. Now it was already the third morning since they left their father's house. They started walking again, but they went deeper and deeper into the forest. And if help did not come soon, they would perish. At midday they saw a beautiful snow-white little bird sitting on a branch, and it sang so sweetly that they stopped to listen to it. And when it had finished, it spread its wings and flew ahead of them. And they followed it until they came to a little house, where it perched on the roof. And as they came closer, they saw that the little house was built of bread, and roofed with cake, and the windows were made of clear sugar. The third morning since leaving their father's house. This has a very New Testament feel to it, doesn't it? Both the reference to a third day and then their father's house, which is referenced a number of times in this fairy tale. Now, I don't think this is an accident, but a subtle, almost stealth mode attempt to elevate your subconscious to think along a more spiritual path during the story. Otherwise, they could have just said their house. And now let's talk about this bird. Do you think this bird was heaven sent with salvation in its wings, or a sinister agent leading them into temptation, as a siren song calls the sailor? I believe it to be very much the former, and I'll get into that a bit later. Let's dig in, said Hansel, and have a blessed meal. I'll eat a piece of the roof, and Gretel, you can eat from the window. It tastes sweet. Hansel reached up and broke off a little piece of the roof to try how it tasted, and Gretel stood by the window and nibbled at it. Then a delicate voice called from inside the house, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's that nibbling at my house?" The children replied, "It is no creature bad or wild. It is but the wind, a heavenly child." In this exchange, Hansel and Gretel replied to the voice that it is a heavenly child, essentially saying, we are ethereal spiritual beings, and so there's really nothing you can do about it. Leave us alone in the same way that you can't do anything about the wind. I guess it seemed like a good idea at the time. And they kept eating without letting themselves be disturbed. Hansel, who found the roof very tasty, tore off a large piece of it, and Gretel knocked out an entire round window pane. Suddenly the door opened, and an ancient woman as old as stone itself, and leaning upon a crutch, came creeping out. Hansel and Gretel were so terrified that they dropped the food, but the old woman nodded her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who has brought you here? Come inside and stay with me. No harm will come to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into her little house. A good meal is set before them, milk and pancakes with sugar, apples, and nuts. Afterward, 2 beautiful little beds were made up with white sheets, and Hansel and Gretel lay down in them, thinking they were in heaven. Now, at what point does one's subconscious become alert of the danger? In the middle of a terrible and dark forest, there's a friendly old woman whose home is made entirely of delicious treats. Now, we can't blame naive and starving Hansel and Gretel here. After all, weren't they led by a beautiful bird? And had they not found the gingerbread house, they surely would have starved. The old woman had only pretended to be friendly, but she was a wicked witch who lay in wait for children and had built the little bread house solely to lure them in. When one came into her power, she killed it, cooked it, and ate it. And that was a feast day for her. Witches have red eyes and cannot see far, but they have a keen sense of smell, like animals, and can detect when humans are nearby. When Hansel and Gretel came close to her, she laughed wickedly and mockingly. "Now I have them. They won't escape me." The witch, just as any predator in the animal kingdom, must understand their prey and adapt to catch and devour them. Here is revealed the archetype of evil that the gingerbread witch embodies. Often overlooked, it is one of the most pernicious, sinister, and real monsters to plague mankind, the devouring mother. Like a black widow spider, it will not only consume its mate, but also, given the chance, its own children. The gingerbread house, a bright, colorful beacon in the center of a dark, sinister forest, is not unlike the bright red hourglass found at the center of the blackest and most deadly of spiders. Once you understand what you are looking at, you will never mistake it for something else. And yet both are mesmerizing, almost hypnotizing, when you look upon them. The gingerbread witch and the black widow are of the same spirit. They are devouring mothers, and in the case of Hansel and Gretel, they are dealing with 2 devouring mothers, the gingerbread witch, of course, and their stepmother, who already preyed upon her foolish and naive husband. Let's continue. Early in the morning, before the children had woken up, she was already up, and when she saw them resting so sweetly, with their full rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That will make a good bite." Then she grabbed Hansel with her bony hand and carried him into a small cage and locked him in with a large barred door. No matter how much he screamed, it did him no good. Then she went to Gretel, shook her awake and yelled, "Get up, you lazy bones. Fetch water and cook something good for your brother who's sitting outside in the stall and is to be fattened up, and when he is fat, I will eat him." Gretel began to cry bitterly, but it was all in vain. She had to do what the wicked witch demanded. Now the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the old woman crept to the little stall and called, "Hansel, stick out your fingers so I can feel if you're getting fat." But Hansel stretched out a little bone instead, and the old woman, who had poor eyesight, couldn't see it, and thought it was Hansel's finger. She wondered why he wasn't getting fat. When 4 weeks had passed, and Hansel remained thin, the witch grew impatient, and didn't want to wait any longer. "Hey, Gretel," she called to the girl, "be quick and fetch water. Hansel may be fat or thin. Tomorrow I will slaughter and cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister wailed as she had to carry the water, and how the tears ran down her cheeks. "Dear God, help us," she cried. "If only the wild animals in the forest had eaten us, at least we would have died together." "Save your crying," said the old woman. "It won't do you any good." Despite their awful situation, Hansel and Gretel remained hopeful and clever. Gretel, though lamenting her state, still makes an appeal to God, and Hansel has shown himself to be quite clever in deceiving the nearly blind witch. The witch, however, begins to make mistakes because of her impatience. Already nearly blind, impatience blinds her completely, and that opens the door to her downfall. Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out, hang the kettle with water, and light the fire. "First we'll bake," said the old woman. "I've already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed poor Gretel toward the oven, from which the flames were already leaping. "Crawl inside," said the witch, "and see if it's properly heated, so we can put the bread in." And once Gretel was inside, she planned to shut the oven and roast her, and then she would eat her. Man, this is a really dark story, isn't it? The Brothers Grimm weren't messing around. Well, at least not yet. The light-hearted part comes later. But Gretel realized what she had in mind and said, "I don't know how to do it. How am I supposed to get in there?" "Stupid goose," said the old woman. "The opening is big enough, can't you see? I could fit in myself." And she crawled up and stuck her head in the oven. Then Gretel gave her a shove, so that she went in deep, closed the iron door, and locked the bolt. Whew! The witch began to howl terribly, but Gretel ran away, and the godless witch had to miserably burn. All right, finally some good news here. Gretel comes in clutch and conquers the devouring mother. No half measures or second guessing. As soon as she saw her opportunity, she was fully committed. The witch was so impatient and angry at this point, or hangry, that she looks upon Gretel with such disdain that she takes her for a complete fool, blind to the possibility that Gretel is tricking her. The witch falls in the very trap she set, and the fiery furnace meant to be Gretel's demise becomes her salvation. Now where have I heard a story like that before? But Gretel ran straight to Hansel, opened his cage, and cried, "Hansel, we're saved, the old witch is dead." Hansel jumped out like a bird from a cage when its door was opened. How they rejoiced! They hugged and kissed and jumped around, and since they no longer had anything to fear, they went into the witch's house. No longer had anything to fear. Have you ever met someone like that? Or maybe you are one of those people. It comes to a tremendous suffering, either by their own hand, another's, or even through the will of God. It is a rite of passage that few are willing to fully undertake, even though everyone should. Those individuals possess an incredible power, so potent you can feel it just when they enter a room. Their demeanor as Moses after communing with Jehovah. They have an amazing gift that is only born from significant sacrifice, suffering, and survival. This is a confidence and strength that cannot be counterfeited. Amazing. But our story is not yet over. In every corner there were chests filled with pearls and jewels. "These are even better than pebbles," said Hansel. and he stuffed his pockets with as many as they could hold. And Gretel said, "I'll take some home too," and filled her apron. "But now we must leave," said Hansel, "so we can get out of the witch's forest." After they had walked for a few hours, they came to a large body of water. "We cannot get across," said Hansel. "I see no footbridge and no bridge." "There's no little boat here either," replied Gretel. "But there's a white duck swimming. If I ask it, it will help us cross." Then she called out, little duck, we're stranded on the shore. No bridge, no luck. Help us, we implore." The duck came over and Hansel sat down on its back and asked his sister to sit with him. "No," Gretel replied, "it would be too heavy for the duck. It should carry us across one at a time." The good little creature did just that. And when they were safely on the other side and had walked for a while, the forest began to look more and more familiar to them. And at last they saw their father's house from afar. They started to run, burst into the room, and threw themselves into their father's arms. The man had not had a single happy moment since he had left the children in the forest. But the stepmother had died. Ha! What a bit of comedy to add to that line. The man had not had a single happy moment, but the stepmother had died. So there's that. Just don't ask how she died. Wink, wink. Now I had to say wink because skeletons can't wink. Gretel shook out her apron and pearls and jewels scattered around the room, and Hansel threw a handful after handful from his pockets. And so all their worries came to an end, and they lived together in pure joy. Now we have a decision to make, like one of those choose-your-own-adventure stories. I love those. Anyway, the Brothers Grimm continued editing this tale throughout their lives. For example, the body of water and the duck. None of that was in the original first edition. But I do wonder what Jacob and William Grimm are telling us here. As Hansel and Gretel never crossed a body of water to get to the Gingerbread Witch's home, why did they have to cross one to get back? Unless this tale ends with a much deeper and more sobering note. Mythologies and religions around the world often use birds as messengers between the spiritual and mortal realm. Hansel and Gretel described 3 birds: the dove that said goodbye, the songbird that took them to the house, and the duck. Being ferried across a body of water is an allegory of transitioning through death to the afterlife and is not a common symbol in mythology and religion. The only instances where this comes up is the ancient Egyptians had to cross the Nile to go to the underworld. The ancient Greeks crossed the river Styx with help of a ferryman who I'll discuss in a future visit. The Norse mythology requires the crossing of the river Hel. The Hindu believed the deceased must cross the Vaitana River to reach the afterlife. The Celtics cross waters to reach Tir na Nog, the land of the forever young. The Mesopotamians and the Babylonians had to cross rivers to reach the afterlife. And Christian hymns often refer to the crossing of waters as metaphors for passing on. Even the hobbitses and elves of Tolkien's Middle-earth left from the harbor of the Grey Havens to cross the great sea to the undying lands of Valinor. So it doesn't happen that often. But when it does, that's usually what it means. And as the duck could only allow passage one at a time, just as we all must make that last great voyage alone, it makes me wonder. Or was it like the Israelites crossing the river Jordan back to their home from their captivity in Egypt, a baptism of water, and are then allowed to return home? As tragic or somber as the depths of Hansel and Gretel would be, they would have returned to their Father in heaven and, as it says, lived together in pure joy. Now I like to think that the ending is face value. They rode a duck and they returned to a penitent father, and thankfully the stepmother was gone. But if it took place in heaven, the stepmother wouldn't be there, would she? I guess if she repented, she would. But how can we be sure? What do you think? And now my fairy tale is done. Hey look, a tiny mouse is on the run. Whoever can catch it could make a big fur cap of it. And so the fairy tale ends on a light note. Make a giant fur cap of a tiny mouse. Who's ever heard of such a thing? I hope you enjoyed this tale of shadow. If so, please share it with your friends, stepmothers, weak fathers, overbearing parents, people that remind you of Hansel and Gretel. Give this video a like, and if you didn't like it, let me know how much you hated it in the comment section. And if you want more about the Gingerbread Witch, I actually wrote a poem about the devouring mother, and I'm quite chuffed about it. You can find it on my channel. Until next time, I bid thee adieu.